So Rivals is back, Taggie and Rupert are back, and age gap bad boy relationships are back. And I feel like it's time to have an honest conversation about why we're all googly-eyed for a relationship that if our friend told us about this over a cup of coffee, that we would be staging an intervention. But because it's a man who looks good playing polo and can hold a very intense stare, transgressions are forgiven. Welcome back to Regency Rumors. I'm Kayla, and here on the channel, I talk about period dramas, history, and historical fiction. And I need to be upfront about something before we dive in. When I am talking about age gap relationships in this video, I am talking specifically about the older man, younger woman dynamic, because that is the predominant pattern that we see in literature and period dramas. So we're going to focus on that today. That's not to say that age gap relationships only exist in that configuration or that toxicity only lives in that configuration. But the literary canon that we're going to be looking at today is Austen, Bronte, du Maurier, Winston Graham with Poldark, and Jilly Cooper now with Rivals. This kind of relationship dynamic is built on a very specific archetype, and that's what we're going to be unpacking in this video. So let's get to it. Look, you guys, does it pain me as a period drama YouTuber to be talking about Rivals as a period drama? Yes, it does, okay? With it being set in the 1980s, some of us are like, that is not like oldie worldy, thank you very much. But unfortunately, if you've watched this show, it really does feel like it's from another time, because it is. I can't believe how much has changed since like the 80s and 90s. I'm gonna have a whole video on why this show is a period drama, but us older folks will complain about that in that video. So for those of you who haven't seen it, Rivals is a British period comedy drama based on Jilly Cooper's 1988 novel, and it is set in this glamorous world of 1980s television set in the Cotswolds. So it has got a stacked cast. It's got David Tennant and Catherine Parkinson, Danny Dyer, and who I'm going to be talking about most today is Alex Hassel as Rupert Campbell-Black. He's a dashing former Olympian and an MP and an estate owner and an absolute total rake. And then Bella McLean as Taggie O Hara, and she is the beautiful daughter of his rival. And the entire internet has been crazy about this 17-year age gap relationship. That is one of the storylines on Rivals, which first premiered in October 2024 on Disney+. Half of the fandom online are dying for more of their scenes, and then the other half have jumped ship because Rupert's escapades are just way too much. Rupert should honestly be the classic ick because of a lot of his actions. And yet, there's a huge part of the internet that loves him anyways, and I just want to unpack maybe why. So the Rupert Campbell-Black that's in the series is not exactly the one that's in the books, but they're very close in terms of the types of actions that they do and the hurt they cause as well. I saw in a 1986 Irish newspaper where he was described as overprivileged, overbearing, and too fond of chasing women, which, ew. But when Taggie and Rupert's story is laid out with more context than maybe we see in a news article, somehow audiences are way more forgiving. And we see that across different examples of literature and period dramas. What is clear though, with as many people that love this sort of thing, is that it is a hot button topic, with people confused on whether we should feel bad for loving these stories. These kind of stories make us feel like we're living in a really weird double standard. Billie Eilish gets dragged for dating a 31-year-old. Leonardo DiCaprio's many relationships with younger women is now a repeated punchline at the Oscars. And yet, we're all watching Rivals and absolutely losing our minds over Rupert and Taggie with this wide age gap relationship. So what's going on with us? Like, what's going on? Well, I've done a little deep diving, and psychologists say we have a deep-seated psychological need to explore high-stakes adult dynamics within a safe environment. In the real world, public relationships are magnified and private ones are hyper-scrutinized because we lack a script to guarantee emotional safety and equal agency between both of the partners. When we consume these relationships as stories, however, the narrative framework provides a safety net that filters out real-world ethical anxiety, and it allows us to safely indulge in the inherent tension and slow-burn chemistry and boundary-crossing romance that culture keeps devouring on page and screen in a bunch of different ways. Psychologist Michael Apter has a name for what's happening when we enjoy something dangerous from behind a screen. So he calls it parapathetic, I think that's correct, emotions, which is, negative emotions like fear or anxiety or discomfort, and they're biologically designed to be unpleasant. They're supposed to make you recoil and, keep you safe. But when those same emotions are experienced inside a safe fictional context, they undergo this kind of cognitive transformation in our brains. Whether it's a book or a TV series, a pure drama setting, they act as what Apter calls a protective aesthetic frame that distances you from real-world consequences. The reader can immerse themselves in the dark, obsessive jealousy of Wuthering Heights or the codependent dynamics of Twilight with intense fascination because they are insulated from the real-life trauma. Like if they had to actually go through those things as a person themselves, they would react very differently. It's a way for us as readers or watchers to be able to feel that intensity without us actually feeling what it's like to go through those things. Our visceral reaction to adult age gap relationships often hinges on this divide between information and intimacy. When a relationship is shown as a black and white news headline, the cold hard facts can look deeply uncomfortable because we lack any personal connection to the people involved, and we can see them clearly for just the facts. Whereas fiction gives us this omniscient view and this extra content so that we can justify what the public would otherwise normally condemn. Quick spoilers for Rival Season 2. When Rupert is exposed in a television segment, every single accusation that shows up on screen is factually true and entirely damning. Yet, because we have been privy to his private, vulnerable interactions with Taggie, we rationalize his behavior, convincing ourselves that he is changing or that the truth is more nuanced than this broadcast can capture. Because in a lot of ways, he now feels like our personal friend, Rupert Campbell-Black. And it is all in how that information is consumed by us. Edmund Burke talked about this in the 18th century with his theory of the sublime, which is the idea that terror and danger can produce delight as long as there's enough distance between you and the actual pain. And fiction is something that can give us that distance between something that should normally be jarring, and real life can't do that. Because when we watch Rupert Campbell-Black look at Taggie like she's the only person in the room, we feel like we're inside the story. We can feel the danger and the pleasure because the screen is protecting us. However, the one emotion that 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant argues that art cannot mediate is disgust. Disgust can make that aesthetic distance collapse and make you want to reject the entire thing. So, successful age gap fiction is constantly walking a tightrope. It's got to give you just enough intensity to thrill you, but not enough of the ick to repulse you. It's got to manage that discomfort very carefully to where you're always questioning how you feel about it, but that you're not completely put off by it altogether so that the story can keep going. Psychologist Albert Bandura spent his career studying how people rationalize behavior that they would normally condemn. He called it moral disengagement, and he identified it as a set of cognitive mechanisms that let us suspend our ethical judgment without realizing that we're doing it. We use palatable language when we talk about things that might otherwise be a bit of an eyebrow raise. So, for instance, Jane Austen's Emma. I love Emma and Mr. Knightley's story. But if this story were written today, there would be some problematic elements, which is why in modern adaptations like Clueless, the love interests are both teenagers of the same age. I think the novel said that he held her as a baby when he was a teenager, and that he's been guiding her behavior since she was a child. Some scholars argue that that is very paternalistic, and it is paternalistic if we see it in basic terms. A grown man who's been shaping a woman's moral development since she was barely in her teens. But Austen frames it as gentle admonishment, as a kind of a mentorship or guidance. And the story calls it love. There's also something called palliative comparison, where we minimize one aspect by comparing it to something much worse. So in Sense and Sensibility, another Austen, Colonel Brandon is a quiet, melancholic gentleman in his mid-30s, and he falls for Marianne Dashwood, who is, I think, 16 or 17. She might be 18. So he's roughly 20 years older than her. He's got this backstory where he's carrying the grief of having lost his first love because she was disgraced and ruined years before. So there is this weight of past heartbreak behind his devotion. But there's a 20-year age gap with a teenager. It feels fine though, because Willoughby exists. We have something to compare to. Willoughby is young and charming, and he seduces and abandons a 15-year-old. And breaks Marianne's heart in the process. Colonel Brandon is a man in his 30s who becomes fixated on a teen girl, if we break it down in mere facts. But in a storyfied way, next to Willoughby, Brandon looks like a saint because his age is not a bad factor in a story of this time period, and also because of his actions. Colonel Brandon recently has been seen as one of the best, most selfless male characters in literature. People have been discussing it a lot on TikTok, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the new Sense and Sensibility coming out in the fall. But I agree. I love the character of Colonel Brandon and how selfless he seems towards Marianne, and what a kind, quiet, patient man he is, not just to someone he's interested in, but to also his community and the people around him. In today's modern terms, he's still way older than Marianne. And that is a hard thing to look past, even in fiction. It feels way more icky for Mr. Wickham to run off with Lydia, who's a similar age to Marianne, because he's not a great person. But because the stories are different, audiences justify the way Colonel Brandon and Marianne get married and their age gap much more easily than Mr. Wickham and Lydia. Audiences do a similar thing with Mr. Rochester from Jane Eyre. Really, Jane Eyre is a vulnerable young woman. She's an orphan, then a governess with no money and no connections, and she arrives at Thornfield Hall to teach a young girl, but then is drawn into the brooding, mysterious owner of the home, Mr. Rochester. He's nearly 40, she's 18 or 19, and the stark facts, spoiler alert for a really old book, is that Rochester locks his wife in an attic and then attempts bigamy with Jane. We feel sorry for Mr. Rochester because he believes he's been tricked into a marriage with a wife who has a severe chronic mental illness, and he claims he's done the best that he can in his current circumstances. Had Rochester committed his wife to a public Victorian asylum, he would have condemned her to a horrific life of physical abuse and neglect and public humiliation. By choosing to put Bertha in a comfortable room with a dedicated nurse, Rochester believed, and a lot of the readers at the time believed, that this was a compassionate, protective alternative to the institutional horrors of the Victorian asylum system. The story gives us something worse to point at: the madhouse. And that suddenly makes Rochester look like a carer rather than a captor. And because the story isn't black and white, it makes us empathize because we question what we would do in such a difficult situation in that time period. Mr. Rochester was tricked into marrying Bertha Mason. His father and brother essentially pushed him into marriage to secure her £30,000 dowry, which in today's money, I think is something like 3 or 4 million pounds. So a lot of money. They concealed her mental illness and they arranged the whole thing for money. And then he became trapped. And he feels like he hasn't chosen this life. And now he's living in a prison that somebody else has built. And all this context that we have around Rochester's life makes us sympathize with a man who locks his wife in an attic more than we sometimes empathize with the woman actually locked in the attic. Prior to the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, a divorce could only be granted by a private act of parliament on the sole grounds of adultery. That was really expensive, and it was legally unavailable for cases of mental illness. The legal landscape saw this rise in what was called the madhouse divorce in the 19th century, where husbands could easily commit unwanted wives to unregulated private asylums, and it stripped them of their remaining legal rights and removed them from their households entirely. Am I going to do a video on how Charles Dickens repeatedly tried to do this to his wife, the mother of his 8 children, so that he could move in his 19-year-old mistress? Yes, I am, but we got so many other things to record in the meantime. But this was something that was happening to women of this time period because they had so little legal rights. And so with all of that context, it seems like Mr. Rochester is a pretty good dude compared to other men that could just do that very freely. Rochester was a victim of a predatory system, but the system victimized Bertha first and far more severely. That, dark, mysterious, and wealthy older man trope is at full play here. And it acts as this really powerful narrative smokescreen to what is really a horror story when it comes to Bertha's life. Mr. Rochester's fortune and brooding and grumpy, gothic charisma allow him to completely control the environment. And he dehumanizes Bertha sometimes. And the narrative actively encourages us to believe that Bertha had it coming because of her, maternal inheritance of madness and her unchaste behavior and her drunkenness. She's blamed for her own imprisonment. And these are mechanisms that the story uses to keep us on Mr. Rochester's side. And they work really well when you don't put them under a microscope like the book talkers do on TikTok. And I get it. I would be a hypocrite if I didn't say I get it because I analyze so many things here on this channel. But teenage me is still hook, line, and sinker. If I were Jane Eyre, I'd be happy to be the bird in his cage. Let's not psychoanalyze that, okay? Let's not dig deep into that. I'm trying to move past that and to see what the younger Gen Zers are talking about with Jane Eyre and some of these classics. And I agree with it, but sometimes old habits die hard. We see this pattern of rewriting reality through moral justification through other literature such as Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. A lot of audiences forgive the brooding, Maxim de Winter for murdering his first wife because the narrative frames the killing as a moral necessity, freeing his estate from a monster rather than the fact that he's committing a crime. Poldark is, and y'all, I really struggle with Poldark. See, this is where this kind of thing is tricky because everybody's got different feelings around different stories like this, where I feel quite lax around Jane Eyre, I think, because I have that emotional tie from reading it as a teenager. I watched Poldark a lot older, and I'm like, I do not care for him as a character. But I have friends and family that love this character, and that they're like, you don't understand what he's been through, though. And I'm like, I do, and I don't like him, And so depending on what your emotional ties are to different stories, are how you're going to react to some of them. But because there was this Poldark phase where, a lot of us were watching a shirtless, beachy Poldark with his nice curly hair as well, Poldark gets away with a lot just for being pretty and getting haughty on occasion. I do not think it's as severe in the latest series, but in the books, Ross takes in a 13-year-old impoverished Demelza, which the reality of the time is that he holds all the cards. Under the Marriage Act of 1753, the system allowed men of his station to exploit lower-class women as disposable mistresses, while also marrying for money. Because Ross defies this norm by legally marrying Demelza, we experience that profound sense of relief that, well, at least he's not one of those guys, right? Like, at least he's not one of these men that are going to go off and marry for money, but be sleeping with his maid all the while. We morally justify the inherent exploitation of their setup as a systematic norm of the 18th century, rather than Ross's personal failure. And this is without me going into their marriage and his emotional affair with his ex-fiancée, yada, yada, yada. But it does make me think, why do we as an audience forgive men like Poldark or Mr. Rochester or Rupert Campbell-Black? Logically, bad behavior should equal bad feelings. Sometimes our brain bypasses this, and let's say invested fans develop highly protective biases towards a protagonist. We become more protective of them over time, and we see them as maybe more moral than they really are. For Taggie and Rupert in Rivals, invested fans with pre-existing feelings can justify Rupert's behavior, while people who maybe haven't seen the show or haven't turned into fans can see it more from an outside perspective and can be like, isn't this relationship kind of problematic? Like, isn't it a mess? And not to say that people who don't love them or hope they're endgame don't see that. Like, I think that they do. There is this justification or this feeling that he can reform in some way, and if it's good enough for her, then it's good enough for us. I love in this latest series where Lizzie turns to Taggie and says, there are less complicated men to fall in love with. But the reality is, because it's fiction, if she did fall in love with some boring guy, we'd be bored. So we love the fact that he's complicated and adventurous and older and morally gray. And a character like Lizzie, she's also in a complicated, out-of-reach love situation too, that we also justify because her circumstances are unkind to her. So this framework works on a bunch of different situations when it comes to literature. Authors frequently use this bias through narrative devices like the unreliable narrator. In Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte relies on a first-person narrative, so we only ever see Rochester through Jane's sympathetic eyes. Because we love Jane, we blindly love the man she loves, allowing her narration to frame which of his toxic actions are forgivable and which are not. The true pull of the age gap romance isn't the number itself, but what the number represents, which is this intoxicating fantasy of being truly understood. While younger suitors are often written as superficial and exciting and unsafe and immature and disloyal, the older man is sometimes broken by life, giving him a psychological depth that allows him to actually see a woman's mind and spirit rather than just her appearance. In fiction, when a young woman feels invisible, being completely seen by someone with the life experience to actually comprehend her worth is incredibly powerful. In Rivals, there's several instances where Taggie's mother is dismissive of her or makes her feel invisible or incapable. But through Rupert's eyes, she feels validated for the first time that she's not those things. For Rupert's part, Taggie is described as having wisdom beyond her years. She sees through his facade, she recognizes his capacity for change, and she actively holds him to a higher moral standard. Taggie disarms and bothers Rupert, and that's attractive to him, and it's attractive to us as an audience. When a story sets up a dynamic where one partner holds all of the cards, the relationship can easily shift from this like grand romance into a severe power imbalance. Without some narrative interventions that authors use to level the playing field, these setups can become a trap disguised as love, where the younger person is completely consumed by the older man's world because of the laws that were in place. In Rebecca, Maxim's second wife is so young and inexperienced that she lacks the tools to challenge him or even manage the household, and she ceases to exist as an independent person the moment that she marries him. We also see this similarly in George Eliot's Daniel Deronda, and that's about the wealthy Hindley Grandcourt, the names in this, and he uses his massive social and financial advantage to crush the spirit of the younger Gwendolyn Harleth, and he isolates her entirely until she feels physically and psychologically trapped. Jane Eyre possesses the rare moral clarity to leave Thornfield, but most of these young women have nowhere else to go and lack the experience to see leaving as an option. When the woman is stripped of her agency, the relationship becomes a trap disguised as a love story. Now, with Rivals being set in the 1980s, we can worry a bit less about Taggie getting trapped financially and not being able to support herself in any way. But some of that maternalistic dynamic shows up in their relationship in season 2. Rupert coldly rejects Taggie under the noble guise of protecting her from his toxic influence. He is deciding when it's safe and when she's ready. He dictates the terms of their connection, rather than that being her decision or it being a joint decision for them to stay away from one another. To get us as an audience to fully commit to these types of romances, the cleverest literature and period dramas actively work to level the playing field between the couple. This makes us feel like the love is a choice rather than a trap by systematically dismantling the structure and balance between the characters. Sometimes this leveling can be socioeconomic. So in Emma, she has an independent fortune. She has absolute domestic dominance in her father's home, which kind of frees her from the Regency era economic pressure to marry for survival like other women. The power reversal occurs when Mr. Knightley makes a radical domestic sacrifice by leaving his own grand estate to move into hers. He subverts that traditional patriarchal expectation of the wife moving in with the husband, and he decides to do what's best for her and her father and moves in with her rather than pulling her into his living situation. And that feels like a very nice equal playing field by the end of the novel between these two people. In other narratives, the leveling requires a physical or a material or a psychological overhaul. So in Jane Eyre, Rochester is blinded and maimed in the fire at Thornfield, and he sort of goes through this egotistical transformation. And then Jane's power comes in when she first refuses to be Mr. Rochester's mistress, and then in gaining an independent inheritance while she's away from him. When she comes back to him, she does not have to marry him for security reasons. She is a fully autonomous equal, proving that it's only after she no longer needs him that she is safely allowed to want him. And then finally, equalization can be achieved through mutual exchange. So where the man yields some social capital to grow a woman's agency. So I'm thinking with Poldark and Demelza. In Poldark, Ross legally marries Demelza knowing it will cause him to be ostracized by the local gentry. And there becomes this reciprocal shift that makes the final dynamic between the two of them feel much better to romanticize, because he's helped bring her up in some way to the gentry class. For Taggie and Rupert, we do know with the books, not quite sure long game for them in the series, but in the short term, Rupert's fast cars and his tennis courts and his mansions and his money aren't appealing to Taggie, which is why she is repulsed and annoyed by him, and she is reluctantly in love with him, which is another thing that's a little bit like, oh, she doesn't want to be in love with him. So why do we keep reading and watching these age gap relationships, especially when a lot of the historical fiction examples have such like toxic power imbalances or rogues for male love interests? Why, knowing all that we know about characters like Rupert, do we still melt when he looks at Taggie and eats his knuckles? A lot of times we as an audience acknowledge that a character's actions are morally wrong, but we choose to separate that moral judgment from our aesthetic appreciation of the story, which explains why, as a teenager, I could care less that Christine was kidnapped by the Phantom of the Opera, because he's sad and he's lonely and she could fix him. And Raoul was boring. I'm sorry, he was so boring. The hair was too coiffed and he was like a stale piece of white bleached toast. I will never understand why she wanted that over like the catacombs of the opera house. Like, you could have had good lighting forever, girly, with those candles. Like, he would have not even been able to see your wrinkles as you age. But whatever, girl. Rupert's behavior towards women is indefensible, but the story of him learning to be better with Taggie is beautiful. We as readers hold these truths at the same time. Morality and enjoyment on sometimes entirely separate tracks. We adjust our own moral compass to align with the logic of the fictional world. We put up with Rupert's behavior because the story has made us want for him to succeed with Taggie. And really, that's exactly what good storytelling is designed to do. The more intense the dynamic, the more committed the audience becomes. Some of us don't stay up till 3 a.m. waiting for a premiere for nothing. But it really, really depends on who the characters are, what the character development is, how the story is played out, what time period it's in, what are the actual boundaries and the context and the conditions, you know what I mean? Like, it all has to be just right for an audience to be okay with something. Readers engage with these types of stories to explore complex character growth and to admire female agency in restrictive historical settings and to sometimes experience a guaranteed happy ending in a world that is so often chaotic and unpredictable. Honestly, this is an uncomfortable subject to wade through in a video like this. But the truth is, these stories give us permission to explore stories that make us uncomfortable. They let us sit in that tension between wanting the bad boy and knowing he's bad for us. I think they let us believe that love can bridge any gap, and sometimes that belief can feel really beautiful. And sometimes it's a really, really problematic trap. And the best age gap romances are the ones that know both of those things at the same time. Because the enduring fascination with age gap relationships in literature is not simple. It interacts with narrative artistry and historical contextualization and psychology. Rivals actually does a decent job of maintaining this balance. Most of the people in the Rivals world are neither purely good or purely bad. They're mainly just like power hungry and wealthy and bored, and, you know, the show essentially just lets them get on with their chaotic behavior, and then it puts on this like gorgeous sun-drenched 1980s filter over the top, and then leaves the final judgment entirely up to us as viewers. It's ultimately up to you to decide whether you think Rupert Campbell-Black is genuinely tantalizing or just a gross older dude. Ultimately, modern media literacy means having the capacity to hold two opposing truths at the same time. We can feel really giddy about watching characters like Taggie and Rupert defy the odds despite his glaring mistakes, while remaining entirely aware of the relationship's structural problems. As an adult, I find myself wading through my own shifting relationship with Jane Eyre, now that I can see its dynamics much more clearly. But that clarity doesn't mean that I won't be tuning in to see how a new adaptation handles the material. And perhaps, as time goes on, future adaptations will continue to get better at balancing all these complicated truths at once. Well, that is it for me, guys. That was a really uncomfortable but also interesting subject to go over and ponder my own feelings on. I still don't completely know where I land. Confession, I really wanted Daenerys to get with, what was his name? Hold on. In Game of Thrones. Jorah. I really was like, oh, he's been through a thing or two and he feels a bit beaten down by the world. But if he were to be there for her and they were to fall in love, that maybe she wouldn't become what she became. But I also knew that that was not going to happen. But that was one instance where I was really, really rooting for it. But at the same time, I know I probably shouldn't. So I am going to go rewatch Poldark and scream at him for 5 seasons because it is therapeutic. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye!